I built this bench when I first started woodworking, and since then I've learned a lot and my standards have gone up. Now I want a bench that looks nice, cleans easy, has clamping capabilities, and has some useful storage. Is that too much to ask? I'm gonna need some upgrades. I plan to replace the top with something that looks nicer and cleans easily. I'm gonna add a vise, and I think I have an idea for a storage solution that will really save me some time and help me work more efficiently. Let's go. Since my old bench top wasn't even bolted down, I couldn't really even clamp a workpiece to that. This made me really excited to install a vise, so I started off by installing that first, which wasn't my best idea. It's great to have a plan. It's even better to have the correct plan with the correct order of how things should be done. I guess that's how we learn sometimes, from experience. I decided I wanted the vise to go here because I'm right-handed and there was room and it would be a great spot. I finally got it installed, but the next part of my plan for this bench was to add tool storage. I thought that it could go on the other side since I work on this side the most. I wanted the tools over here, so that meant the vise needed to move, which there's another good spot for it right here. Installing the vise in spot number 2, I was hoping to make less mistakes. I originally had a spacer to move the vise outwards so it didn't hit the new top that was going on next. I decided it would be better to center the vise front bolts on the bench frame for strength. This made the install a lot simpler. I would just have to deal with the top being in the way later on. I made a template earlier of the mounting holes for the vise, and this was very helpful. I would totally recommend doing this. It's a lot easier to mock up a piece of scrap plywood than the heavy vise. For the back bolts, I added blocking and then I recessed the bolts so they would fit underneath the future bench top. It's always easiest to use the big Forstner bit first and then finish the hole the rest of the way using the center marker from the Forstner bit. With the holes lined up and drilled out, I screwed the blocking pieces back into the bench. Next, I slid the vise into the rear bolts I left hanging down and added a clamp to hold the vise in place, so I could then pre-drill the holes and put in the front bolts. After tightening down the back bolts, I finally had a vise on this workbench, and I was really stoked to have the first step of this build completed. From there, I went to put on the new top for this bench, and the first thing I had to do was remove the vise again. You can see it on the floor here, but I'll get it figured out eventually. My old workbench top was MDF sealed with shellac. I was never a big fan of the color and it got beat up pretty fast with heavy use. For my new top, I'm going to use MDF again, but add laminate to the top to add protection, and I think it'll look much nicer and should be easier to keep clean. I cut out a large section for the main outfeed and work area, and then I cut out 2 smaller sections for the areas to the sides of the table saw to act as extensions. I remember buying a small amount of oak to trim out my first bench top. I couldn't believe how expensive it was. Now, after a few years of projects and not being great at getting rid of any scraps, I had options to choose from for the trim this time. I did some work for a friend a while back in exchange for some ash slabs. Unfortunately, that friend passed away, and so I decided I wanted to trim out my bench out of that ash this time as a reminder of sorts. It would have been easier to use something milled out already, but I wanted to use this for the sentimental value and to be reminded of that friend often. I do not know what was going on with this piece that I already cut. I think it's safe to say a clean work area is a safer one. I was almost able to get all the trim I needed from pieces that were cut offs. I only needed the one strip I cut off the slab that I turned into 2 long pieces of trim. To glue the trim on, I did need to get a little creative. Even my longest pipe clamps weren't long enough. I've used couplers to put 2 of these clamps together in the past, but this glue up didn't need a lot of clamping force, so I rotated the back end of the pipe clamps 90 degrees and then used the F-style clamps for the extra length. Since I have a domino, I use it to keep the trim aligned and flush with the MDF. Last time I used some brad nails. For the side trim, the pipe clamps had plenty of length to keep it clamped on until the glue dried. The fence on this DeWalt table saw is pretty awesome for a job site saw. It has a rack and pinion design that attaches to the front and back of the table. To keep it as close as I can get to the outfeed table, I took off the locking mechanism long ago in the back, and it still connects and is very sturdy. To get even closer, I decided to remove this tab. I forgot to put a piece of trim right here, so I'm going to try to add it now. I hope I don't regret this decision later on. To add a piece of trim, I carefully lined up the track and made the cut. or most of it, because I wanted the side trim to stay on to cover the end grain of this piece. I then used a pull saw to finish up the rest of the cuts. Then there was a little fine tuning to do with the chisel. With a nice fit, finally, I added a chamfer to the piece of trim and I glued it in. Then I could trim off the extra trim on each side. I did need an angle on this side so the fence didn't hit it. There was also some slight work to be done to make the trim perfectly flush with the MDF. Excuse me, Wisp. So now it's time to deal with a problem I left myself earlier when I installed the vise. I usually try to be really kind to my future self, but it just didn't happen this time. I really didn't want to cut into the trim here, but this was the easiest and best way to install this after thinking about it for way longer than I should have. The steel back piece of the vise is almost the same depth or thickness as the bench trim, so the trim was able to fit nicely behind the birch that I put into the vise as the jaws that actually do the holding. I only needed to remove some trim the width of the steel so the top didn't rest on it. I drilled some holes with the Forstner bit at the corners, and I couldn't figure out a better way to remove the material, so I just used the dreaded jigsaw on my almost perfect ash. To clean that up, I used a flush trim bit. The bearing of the bit ran against the bottom of the MDF top that is glued to the trim, and that made the cutout much cleaner. I did a little work with the chisel, but this wasn't as clean as I wanted, but it really isn't noticeable at all in this location. It will really be hidden once I make a bigger set of jaws that match the height of the table. The vise will have to come off again for that to happen, so that will have to wait. I'm done removing it for now. To store my measuring tools closely while not being in the way, my plan is to install a barn door track so I can slide the tools hanging from it back and forth so I can have easy access to both the drawer here and this area underneath to the right where I like to set my tools out of the way during projects. To install the track, I use drywall screws to basically just tack it into place. This gave me a chance to make sure I had it in the correct spot. It also marked the hole locations. I then removed each screw and pre-drilled for the correct mounting hardware in the locations where the drywall screws left their marks. Been struggling with this little side extension area. My table isn't flat and level perfectly, which I'm not going back to rebuild the whole thing at this point. So I'm going to do the best I can. For the left side of the table saw, I'm taking apart my extension support. I really want it to be close to being flush. Anytime I cut something wider than the saw top, it will support the workpiece and it'll be really helpful for more accurate cuts. This is the riving knife release lever, so this area that I've marked out needs to be removed so I can access it when needed. So before I got all crazy on the bandsaw, I should have just took it over to the drill press and drilled holes to make these curves. Now I'm gonna have to get out my spindle sander. Spindle sander is right there behind those boards. This is actually working really well. I need to find a better location for this thing. I would probably use it a lot more. To get the wobble out of here and get it where I want, I'm going to add a support here. It means I need to move my switch for my dust collection. Just a cord that runs to the back that turns on the dust deputy and shop vac. And now it should be unplugged. Alright, so this needs to come flush, the bottom of the level up here at the top. I'm going to use my tape measure. Actually, use my tape measure to push it up. Lock it. So I'm 8 7/8. I'm going to add 2 3/4. There it is. And that'll give me my measurement that I need for the inside here. Or not, it looks good. The back of the side extension was already level with the back of the saw. With the front support now making the front of it level,
I could draw a straight line and cut out the side piece with the track saw. Then on the bandsaw, I cut a relief so I could still easily get to the riving knife lever. Then I screwed the front and back pieces all together and made sure it was square. To finish the side off, I added a little shelf to hold the blade changing wrenches and the miter gauge Allen tool. For the side to the right of the saw, I made a template by tracing the saw from underneath. I cut out the template and then I traced that onto my piece of plywood so I could match the side curves. Lastly, both sides got a rounded corner over at the router table. I finally get to work on the idea that made me excited about upgrading this bench in the first place. Like I said earlier, I made some changes and now I work on this side the most. So it's time to move my most used tools off the French cleat wall and over here. I started with a piece of Baltic birch plywood that I stained black with some India ink. I then milled more live edge cutoffs into small enough pieces to make a border with more ash trim to match the bench. I used miters for the corners this time. I didn't make them perfect, but I am improving at them. I use the technique of matching the angle that looks best on the bevel gauge to the miter gauge. This miter gauge is definitely helping me make more accurate cuts. I use pin nails in the top and bottom pieces in spots that won't be seen, and for the sides, I just added clamps until the glue dried. I left the scrap piece hanging on the track for a few days to make sure this idea would work out and the tool door wouldn't get in my way. To mount this tool storage board to the barn door track, I used threaded inserts. To do that, I drilled holes into but not through the Baltic birch. I left the trim proud of the plywood for extra protection and looks, so I left the threaded inserts sticking out just enough so the brackets didn't hit the trim. Threaded inserts are perfect for this application in case I want to remove the tool storage later on and hang it somewhere else. I'm looking forward to using this because it's so easy to move out of the way when I want to store a tool on the shelf behind it, and I'll still be able to get access into this drawer. All the tools I store in here will be right next to me when I'm standing here working. Getting on to some of the final touches of this bench upgrade, I definitely think it's time for a handle on this drawer. With the tool door in front of it, there's very little clearance and a handle can't stick out, so it needs to be recessed into the drawer. I used this style once before when I built a platform bed. I'll leave a link to that. I marked out where the handle will go and then drilled some holes to remove some material. Next, I taped a straight edge to the drawer face to flush cut the area needed to fit the handle. To install the drawer face, I used double-sided tape again, and then I added a couple of screws from the inside. I still needed more space for the handle because I only used 1/4 inch material for the face. So I got out a template bit with a bearing and used it to hog another 1/4 inch or so of material out of the drawer box plywood. I could then screw the handle on and finally not have to grab the bottom of the drawer anymore to open it. To add tools on my tool barn door, I made some custom hangers for the tools I wanted to store on here. I may show some more tool storage tips in a future video if there's interest. This one got some magnets to hold some layout tools and a marking knife. To hold a set of my most used drill and impact bits, I made a small frame with holes in the top to nicely cradle my bits, and I made a strong, solid shelf with some slots in it to support my squares that I use the most.
After having to roll this laminate in my shop for 3 months, I was finally ready to use it, and when I opened the box, it was all smashed up.
Don't think this is gonna work. I was wondering why it was so hard to get out of the box. I had a few other setbacks and I had to pay more, but I finally got what I needed. The lesson is to check your materials when you get them so they're ready to go when you are. After watching a few videos on installing laminate sheet, I ordered a scoring tool and I used that first. It worked fine until I got impatient and I scored off my line a little, and it wasn't a big deal until I ripped the sheet. Next, I tried to cut it with a power tool, of course, so I used a track saw. This worked well and it cut clean. I was sure I had the blade depth just deeper than the laminate sheet and had a flattened cardboard box under it, but I still did the unthinkable. I cut through the small piece I was cutting and through the large laminate sheet I had already cut out and through my brand new bench top and trim. I definitely wanted to cry at this point, and this is why I can't have nice things. Not only did I cut into that, cut into this. Luckily, I still had a piece big enough to cut out the top section a second time. I was ultra careful. I just used some snips. I also left it quite a bit larger than my top with the hope that the flush trim bit would cut it clean after gluing it on. I opened the garage door just after the shot and it had a fan running. Contact cement isn't the best smelling stuff. Hours later, my wife got mad at me that the house still smelled bad, and of course, I could no longer smell it. I rolled the contact cement on and I used 2 coats on the MDF. It needs to dry before the 2 surfaces are added together, and this took longer than normal because of the temperature was lower than preferred according to the directions for the contact cement. I did a small section first and then the big one. It needs to be set in place perfectly before the 2 surfaces can touch. Once that happens, there's no moving it around. With the sheet in place, I could remove the spacers I added to keep the 2 surfaces from touching. It's best to start in the middle and work your way outward to prevent bubbles or wrinkles. The directions require a decent amount of force to be applied, so a strong roller like this is required. After a day or so for the contact cement to cure, the next step is to flush trim the laminate to the top. I was careful and went slow. I used a spiral flush trim bit and I was happy with how clean it cut. Last, I used a chamfer bit to give the edge a profile, add more protection, and to make it look nicer.
After using this upgraded bench for a few weeks, I'm really happy with the added tool storage and the way it looks. The cut I made into the bench isn't noticeable, and I will use that piece of laminate for a smaller project. I'm not completely convinced that the laminate will hold up and be as durable as I want, but only time will tell. Let me know if there are any other upgrades you would recommend. Thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next one.